What's up, everyone? I'm Sierra, and today we're going to talk about Fannie Lou Hamer and her role in the civil rights movement. To start out, although Abraham Lincoln abolished slavery in the 1860s, segregation and oppression toward African Americans remained constant for decades following the Civil War. African Americans were forced to attend separate schools, ride separate transportation, or the same transportation vehicle, just at the back of it, because that makes sense. They were forced to use separate water fountains and take literacy tests just to be able to vote. And those were just a few of the ways they were oppressed. Seriously, we could go on for hours and hours talking about the horrific acts of segregation and oppression. Many white people, specifically those in government, argued that African Americans were separate but equal under the law, meaning they were equal in quality. This was solidified in the Plessy versus Ferguson case, in which Homer Plessy was petitioning to ride an only whites train. He was denied, the court basically ruling that if black people had access to all of the same things white people did, such as transportation and education, then there was no reason to raise a fuss, which obviously was totally wrong and only contributed to the massive oppression. Here's a little fun fact. White people then had a major othering complex, which caused them to alienate groups that weren't them. In addition, they saw themselves as the more powerful group, and were pretty much unwilling to give up any power. This time of segregation and oppression was definitely a huge example of othering. Anyway, life was getting worse and worse for African Americans, and nothing was being done. The Supreme Court ruled segregation to be legal, and the government was turning a blind eye. There had to be a change. Cut to Martin Luther King, one of the most prominent faces of the civil rights movement. He spent his adult life working toward equality. In his famous speech given at the March on Washington, entitled "I Have a Dream," he said, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Equality truly was the ultimate goal." King was the leader of one of the first nonviolent groups fighting for equality. Under his wing, sit-ins like the one at Woolworthy, bus boycotts like the Montgomery bus boycott, and marches like the March on Washington were organized to show the injustices that were being served to African Americans. He urged members of the black community to break unjust laws, but be prepared to pay the punishment for doing so. And boy, did they ever. The civil rights movement can be pinned down from the late 40s to late 60s. It took many years, many protests, violence, and even death until African Americans were finally provided rights and protection under the law. Acts passed along the way increasingly integrated African Americans into society. Acts such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that outlawed employment discrimination based on race, the Voting Acts Right of 1965 that outlawed literacy tests in order to vote, and the Fair Housing Act that provided equal opportunity for housing for all. There are so many other details about the civil rights movement, but I'm going to shift focus to Fannie Lou Hamer, an important player in the civil rights movement. Fannie was born in 1917 in Mississippi to a family that were sharecroppers. She was the youngest of 20 children. Yeah, you heard me, 20. When she was 12, she dropped out of school to help out more on the plantation, so she spent the good majority of her early life in the cotton fields. In the 1940s, she married and she and her husband ran the plantation. She herself as the timekeeper since she knew how to read and write. She was 45 when she joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, where she traveled the country encouraging African Americans to register to vote. They received a lot of hate and backlash as an organization, and in the end, Fannie was one of 2 African Americans who were allowed to vote. She was then kicked out of her parents' plantation and fired from her job for registering to vote, but she wasn't done rocking the world. One major challenge Fannie faced was what was called the Mississippi appendectomy, which she received when a white doctor was supposed to be removing a tumor. Basically, it's when white doctors would perform hysterectomies on black women without their consent, and this was done in order to keep black people from producing, which was pretty freaking messed up. This is a picture of Fannie as a delegate at the 1964 Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City. Having co-founded the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, she ran for Congress representing that party. She was able to televise the struggles she and other African Americans face, such as the Mississippi appendectomy. As both African American and a woman, she faced even more obstacles to be taken seriously as a political leader, something we see when we analyze the civil rights movement with an intersectional attitude. She did not win, but her candidacy turned the nation's attention toward the oppression she and others faced. Later, Fanny helped found the National Women's Political Caucus, which is an organization that supports women who are interested in being involved in government, and this organization still operates today. Fanny passed away in 1977 from breast cancer after a life dedicated to civil rights. Her efforts to increase African American voters and women in government will not and cannot be forgotten. We would like to think, since the civil rights movement happened in the past, that there is no longer any oppression toward African Americans. The sad reality is that it continues, often in different ways than were seen in the 60s. The Black Lives Matter movement is an extension of civil rights, protesting acts of violence that are targeted toward Black individuals. Other microaggressions, such as not being considered for a job or not taken seriously in a workplace, is also evidence of that oppression. Let us be like Fannie Lou Hamer, who was not afraid to advocate for what she thought was right. She stood up in front of the nation to showcase her struggles and why they were unjust. We still have a long way to go to reach equality, but I hope we can remember women like Fanny and continue to fight for it.